a routine traffic stop, a taxi on a quiet street. But when the officer opens the back door, his breath catches in his throat. The woman inside? Someone he never expected to see. And in that moment, everything changes. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet street. It could have been the early morning or the late afternoon. Either way, the neighborhood was still and calm. The occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of a breeze was the only sound, but that silence was about to be shattered. A bright yellow taxi sat pulled over to the side, the engine humming quietly as it waited. Nearby, a police officer in a dark blue uniform stood, his checkered hat perched firmly on his head, surveying the scene. Officer Ryan Carter had been on patrol, following his usual route through this quiet part of town. Everything had seemed ordinary, a typical day until now. As he approached the vehicle, the taxi driver, a middle-aged man in a white shirt and tie, kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The posture was rigid, as if he were bracing himself for something. But it wasn't the driver who caught Officer Carter's attention. It was the woman in the back seat. She sat quietly, clutching the door handle, her fingers wrapped tightly around it as though she were about to spring from the car at any moment. Her face, pale and tense, was framed by long brown hair, her eyes wide and darting as though she were waiting for something, or someone. As the officer leaned closer, his eyes met hers. And in that instant, Officer Carter's breath caught in his throat. There was something about her, something familiar. The fear etched on her face, the way she seemed to tremble ever so slightly. It was as if the world had stopped for just a moment, and all he could focus on was the woman in the back seat of the taxi. He blinked, trying to shake off the sudden tension building in his chest. Why does she look like she's about to run? His gaze swept over her once more. She wasn't just a frightened woman. There was something more. She looked like someone he knew. But from where? He racked his brain, searching through faces and memories, but nothing came to him immediately. He had seen hundreds of faces in his line of work, but this one, it gnawed at him. Her eyes, they haunted him. He had seen them before, but where? His posture stiffened, the air suddenly feeling thick with unease. Officer Carter had been on countless traffic stops before, but this felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for the first time in years, he felt a cold rush of something unfamiliar. Fear, but not for his safety. No, it was something deeper. Something about this woman, something about the situation, screamed that things were not as they appeared. "Ma'am," Officer Carter called out, his voice slightly shaky, though he kept it professional. "Can you tell me what's going on here?" For a moment, the woman didn't respond. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, where she briefly made eye contact with the driver, who seemed to flinch. She turned back to Officer Carter, her lips trembling as she opened her mouth. I, she stammered, as if words were failing her, as if she was struggling to find the courage to speak. Her breath quickened, and she seemed to shrink back, her body curling slightly away from the officer. He could feel the panic emanating from her. Whatever she was running from, it was coming closer. What was it? And then it hit him. Sarah Monroe. The name hit his brain like a freight train, and the recognition slammed into him with an unsettling force. His eyes widened as the memory resurfaced. The face, the voice, the woman he had known years ago, someone from his past. He remembered her from the local news, from the tragic stories, the woman who had disappeared. Sarah Monroe? Officer Carter's voice was more a statement than a question now. The woman's face paled even further, and she pulled at the door handle, as though she were about to flee from the taxi. She had known this moment was coming, the moment someone would remember her. But why now? She looked at him with a desperate, panicked expression, and for a brief second, Officer Carter could see the tiniest flicker of something that looked like recognition, but also fear, pure and raw, fear of him, of what he would do next. Her lips moved, but no sound came. "Please," she finally whispered, barely audible. "Please, don't make me go back." Officer Carter's chest tightened. His hand instinctively hovered near his radio. He needed backup. But as he reached for it, his eyes flicked back to the taxi driver. The man had remained eerily silent, but now his grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. His face was mostly turned away, though his body was as stiff as a board. He wasn't just a bystander in this moment. He was hiding something. Officer Carter's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. There was more to this story than he was seeing, and it wasn't going to end with just a few simple questions. As he looked back at Sarah Monroe, the weight of the situation settled on him like a lead balloon. The past was about to collide with the present, and neither of them were ready for what was coming next. For years, Officer Ryan Carter had thought Sarah Monroe was gone forever. 5 years had passed since the last time he'd seen her, and yet her face had never left his mind. Her case was one that had haunted him, a case that had slipped away into the darkness, unresolved. Sarah had vanished without a trace, just another name on the list of missing persons, but this one was different. This one had lingered in his mind, a cold case that refused to be forgotten. It had all started the night she disappeared. Ryan had been the officer on duty. He remembered it like it was yesterday. He'd seen her in the parking lot, a young woman with long brown hair, dressed casually, clearly out of place in the late hours of the night. He had approached her to ask if she needed help. She had been standing next to her car, eyes downcast, almost as though she were waiting for something or someone. She had smiled at him, the kind of smile that seemed almost forced. She hadn't said much at first, just enough to confirm she was fine. But something about her was off. Her body language screamed unease, and when Ryan had asked if she was sure she didn't need any assistance, she had hesitated before saying, "No, I'm fine. Just waiting for someone." Ryan had given her a quick nod, telling her to stay safe before getting back in his patrol car. He hadn't thought much about it at the time. He couldn't have known then that those would be the last words she would speak to anyone for a long time. That night, she disappeared without a trace. No ransom, no leads, nothing to go on but the vague words she had uttered, and the hours that passed with no sign of her. For weeks, the investigation had been frantic. Officers combed through every inch of her neighborhood, interviewed her friends, and scoured nearby areas. But Sarah Monroe was gone. As the weeks turned to months, and the months turned to years, the case slowly faded into the back of everyone's minds. The news stopped covering it. The searches grew quieter. The case file gathered dust. But Ryan never forgot. He couldn't forget her face, the expression she had worn that night, the fear that he hadn't been able to read at the time. Now, here she was, sitting in the back of a taxi, alive. But something was terribly wrong. Ryan's heart raced as he looked into the back seat of the car, finally putting the pieces together. The woman sitting there, clutching the door handle with a look of terror in her eyes, was unmistakably Sarah Monroe. There was no mistaking that face. That was the girl he had seen all those years ago. The same long brown hair, the same eyes that now stared at him with pure fear. But why hadn't she come forward? Why hadn't she made herself known? Why had she been hiding, running, if she was really free? And more importantly, why was she so afraid? The questions flooded his mind as he watched her shift uncomfortably in the back seat. Her eyes darted between him and the driver as though she was trying to gauge whether it was safe to speak. But she didn't. She stayed silent, gripping the door handle so tightly her knuckles went white. She was trapped in a state of fear, a fear that Ryan could feel just from standing near the car. He had seen enough fear in his line of work to recognize it immediately. But this wasn't just ordinary fear. This was terror. The man in the driver's seat, dressed in a white shirt and tie, didn't seem to care much about what was going on. His hands gripped the wheel, but his face was slightly turned away, either waiting for something or hiding something. He had said nothing when Ryan had approached, and his posture was unnerving, almost like he was waiting for some kind of signal. The silence between them was suffocating. Ryan's mind raced, trying to piece together what he knew. He had been the one to see Sarah last. He had been the last person to interact with her. So why did it feel like everything about this encounter was off? Why was she here, alive and yet so terrified? Her disappearance had never been explained. There were no ransom demands, no strange calls, no letters. She had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. The only connection anyone had to her was the last encounter she'd had with him. He had tried to move on. The case was closed, but this was a whole new mystery, a chapter that was far from over. He stared at Sarah, her fearful eyes locked on his. And in that moment, he realized, this wasn't just a chance encounter. Something was wrong. She wasn't running from her past. She was running from something else, someone else. Ryan's stomach twisted as he realized that whatever had kept her hidden for all these years was still out there, and it was closer than anyone had ever imagined. Officer Ryan Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step closer to the taxi. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension that made every second stretch into eternity. His eyes were locked on Sarah Monroe, whose gaze had shifted quickly from him to the taxi driver. There was something in the way she looked at him, something desperate. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was pleading, silently asking for something. Ryan's instincts flared. He followed her gaze to the driver. The man was gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his face half turned away. But now, something about him didn't sit right. The slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his fingers twitched, the subtle tightness in his posture. It was all wrong. For the first time, Ryan felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was more than just an ordinary traffic stop. This was something else entirely. The atmosphere felt charged with impending danger. Sarah, in the back seat, was still gripping the door handle, her knuckles pale. Ryan saw her fingers tremble, the movement barely perceptible, but enough to show just how much she was holding herself back. She wasn't ready to flee, at least not yet, but the fear radiating off her was palpable. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Sarah's lips moved. Her words were so soft, so faint, that Ryan had to lean in closer to catch them. "Please, don't let me go." It was a subtle plea for help, a cry wrapped in the silence of the moment. Ryan's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a random stop, not just a simple case of a woman looking for a ride. There was something darker at play here. Sarah's terror wasn't just from being caught, it was from something worse. The kind of fear that gripped you deep down, the kind that could break a person. He had seen it before in his line of work, but this time it felt personal. Ryan's training kicked in. Every instinct he had screamed that this was a life-or-death situation. He didn't know who Sarah was running from, but he knew the danger wasn't over yet. He had to act quickly. And the first step was ensuring Sarah's safety, no matter the cost. The driver, who had been stiff and silent, was now sweating even more. His eyes flickered to Sarah briefly before darting back to the rearview mirror, avoiding Ryan's gaze. He was trying to keep his composure, but it was clear he was cracking. Ryan's hand hovered over his radio, ready to call for backup. "Where are you watching from?" Ryan's voice, though calm, was filled with urgency. "And if you were in this officer's shoes, what would you do next?" His fingers brushed the radio, preparing to send the call, but before he could make a move, the situation escalated in an instant. The driver's hand jerked toward the glove compartment, his actions quick, almost too quick. The movement was sharp and sudden, as if he was reaching for something that could be dangerous. Ryan's reflexes kicked in before he even fully processed the action. His hand moved to his holster, fingers curling around his gun as he stepped back, creating space between him and the vehicle. His heart was hammering in his chest, but his training kept him focused. If the driver was reaching for a weapon, it was a split-second decision to act. "Step away from the glove compartment," Ryan commanded, his voice firm and authoritative, cutting through the tension like a blade. Sarah gasped, her hand trembling even more as she leaned toward the door, her eyes wide with panic. Her breathing was ragged, and Ryan could see her fear building. She was a witness to something she couldn't control. And now, she was about to be caught in the middle of something even more dangerous. The seconds stretched long as Ryan kept his weapon trained on the driver. Every muscle in his body was tense, the situation a powder keg about to explode. He kept his eyes fixed on the driver's hands, watching for any signs of movement, his senses alert to every shift, every breath. The man in the driver's seat froze, his hand inches from the glove compartment. He seemed to hesitate, then slowly pulled his hand back, lifting his palms up in surrender. His face was drained of color now, and his eyes flicked nervously between Ryan and Sarah. I'm just looking for the registration," the driver stammered, his voice unsteady. "Nothing's going on, I swear." Ryan didn't let his guard down. He wasn't buying it. The tension in the air was suffocating. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Ryan commanded again, his voice unwavering. "Step out of the vehicle, slowly." For a moment, there was only silence. Sarah was still gripping the door, her knuckles pale, eyes wide with terror. But now, she wasn't looking at the driver anymore. She was watching Ryan, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. The driver's hands remained in the air as he slowly opened the door, stepping out of the car under Ryan's watchful eye. Ryan's mind raced. Was he really just looking for the registration? Or was there something more? The story didn't add up. There was more to this taxi ride than met the eye. Ryan was ready. His training, his instincts, they were all pointing in the same direction. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't just a simple traffic stop. The real danger was about to be uncovered, and he had to be prepared for whatever came next. Officer Ryan Carter's pulse raced as the tension in the air thickened. The driver's hesitant movements only fueled the suspicion building in Ryan's mind. He had already seen enough. The man's nervous sweat, the way his eyes flicked between Sarah and Carter, said everything. Ryan's training kicked in. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was the breaking point. Hands where I can see them. Ryan's voice cut through the silence, sharp and controlled. His gun remained in his hand, steady but ready. The officer's posture was rigid, every muscle taut, and his eyes never left the driver. Every inch of his body was primed for action. The driver hesitated. His fingers twitched nervously before he slowly raised his hands, palms facing forward. The air between them felt electric, every second dragging on, and yet it was Sarah's reaction that spoke volumes. Ryan's eyes flicked back to the woman in the back seat. She hadn't spoken since he'd approached the car, but now her eyes were wide, and her hand was trembling, gripping the seatbelt with a desperation that sent a chill running down Ryan's spine. Sarah was scared, more scared than she had ever been before. She looked as though she was about to collapse, but she didn't. Instead, her mouth opened, her voice barely above a whisper. "He took me." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and he froze for a fraction of a second. His blood ran cold as his mind tried to process what he had just heard. He had already suspected something was terribly wrong, but now, hearing Sarah's words, it all started to fall into place. This wasn't just a random taxi ride. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the moment Ryan had feared. The truth, raw and unfiltered. "What do you mean, Sarah?" Ryan asked. His voice strained with urgency as he took a step closer to the car. His eyes never left the driver's face, watching for any signs of a reaction. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as her voice cracked. "He's the one who took me, and he never let me go." The words hung in the air, heavy with fear and truth. For years, Sarah had been missing, gone without a trace. The case had gone cold. But now, everything that had been left unsaid, all the mystery and confusion, was finally unraveling. The pieces fell into place, and Ryan's heart sank. This man, this taxi driver, had been keeping her captive. He was the one responsible for her disappearance. The last 5 years were a lie, a cruel, twisted lie that Sarah had been forced to live. The driver's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He started shaking his head, his eyes flicking from Sarah to Carter, his voice rising in desperation. "She's lying!" the driver barked, his hands now shaking. "I was just giving her a ride. She's mistaken." Ryan didn't even flinch at the driver's denial. He had seen enough liars in his years on the force to know exactly when someone was guilty. The man's reaction was all too familiar. The panic, the shaking, the words that were too quick, too rehearsed. This man was trying to cover up the truth, but the truth was already written in Sarah's eyes. Ryan's hand tightened around the door handle. He didn't need to hear another word from the driver. The game was over. The man's protests meant nothing now. In one swift motion, Ryan yanked the door open. The driver's eyes went wide, his body jerking backward in surprise. Ryan's gun remained drawn, his posture solid and commanding. The driver was cornered, his facade crumbling. There was no escape for him now. "You're under arrest," Ryan said, his voice cold, final. The words echoed in the stillness between them. The driver's mouth opened and closed, his face draining of color. His body stiffened as the weight of the situation settled in. Sarah had already told her truth. There was no denying it anymore. The man who had kept her locked away, hidden for 5 long years, was now in custody. And for the first time in half a decade, Sarah would no longer have to live in fear. Ryan didn't need to say more. He motioned for the backup officers who had arrived at the scene. Within seconds, they were on the driver, handcuffing him and pulling him from the car. Ryan glanced at Sarah, his expression softening. Her fear hadn't vanished, not yet, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes now. Relief. The nightmare was finally over. The driver was hauled away, his protests fading into the background. But Ryan's focus remained on Sarah, the woman who had been taken, the woman who had come back. "You're safe now," Ryan said gently, his voice carrying a note of reassurance. It was a promise, a truth that would never be taken back. Sarah's face crumbled, her tears flowing freely now. She hadn't just been found, she had been heard. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment the door swung open, the driver's fate was sealed. Officer Ryan Carter's heart was still racing, but he couldn't let his emotions take over now. He had to focus. He had to make sure this ended right here, right now. Ryan spoke quickly, his voice firm and controlled as he called in for backup. "This is Officer Carter. I need backup at the corner of Elm and 5th. We've got a situation with a missing person. She's been found, but the suspect is in custody." He didn't wait for a response before hanging up. There was no time to waste. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the tense silence, growing louder as another patrol car pulled up. The officers quickly got out, and without a word, moved in on the driver. His protests grew louder, but it didn't matter anymore. He was going down. The officers yanked him out of the taxi, handcuffing him with swift precision, and shoved him against the car. Ryan stepped back, his attention focused on Sarah, who had stayed in the back seat, her eyes locked on the scene unfolding before her. The weight of what had just happened began to settle on her shoulders, but she was still trembling, still processing the truth that was finally coming to light. The fear that had haunted her for so long still lingered in her eyes, but now there was a flicker of hope. The driver was completely silent now, his head bowed in defeat. But Ryan wasn't done yet. There was still the matter of the evidence, the concrete proof that would tie everything together and ensure the man couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Ryan motioned for the officers to search the car. One of them opened the glove compartment and pulled out a fake ID, clearly not belonging to the driver. His fingers tightened around the card, his eyes scanning it quickly before moving on. The evidence was starting to pile up, but they needed more. "Search the trunk," Ryan ordered, his voice steady. The trunk popped open with a loud click, and the officer's flashlight immediately illuminated the contents inside. Duffel bags, several of them neatly packed but ominous in their weight. The officer reached in and unzipped the first bag. Inside were ropes, restraints, and a collection of items that sent a chill down Ryan's spine. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was planned. And it wasn't the first time. He had been right all along. This wasn't some innocent ride. The man wasn't just giving Sarah a lift. He had been taking her again. It was clear now. The fake ID, the restraints, the bags, it all pointed to something far more sinister. The man had been stalking her, holding her captive. And if not for Ryan's timely intervention, who knew how much longer Sarah would have been trapped in his clutches? Ryan's stomach turned as he thought about the years Sarah had spent living in fear, the terror that had marked every day of her life since that night she disappeared. She had been living in a nightmare, and now, finally, she was awake. He glanced over at Sarah, who had turned her gaze from the scene to him. Her face was pale, tears still streaming down her cheeks. She looked fragile, like the weight of everything had just crashed down on her. And then she gasped for air, clutching her chest, her body trembling. The pain and the fear of those years seemed to catch up to her all at once. "I thought I'd never escape him," she whispered, her voice barely audible, broken. Ryan took a step toward her, his heart aching for her. He knew there were no words that could take away the pain, the years of fear she had suffered, but he still had to try. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch light, as if to remind her that she wasn't alone anymore. "You're safe now, Sarah," he said softly, his voice steady, but filled with compassion. "He'll never touch you again." Her body trembled with the release of emotions she had clearly been holding back. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to break down, her face crumpling in anguish. She cried, not just for the pain she had endured, but for the weight of freedom that was finally within her reach. The officers continued their search of the car, the evidence mounting. But for Ryan, the most important thing right now was Sarah. She'd been through too much, and the journey ahead was far from over. The road to recovery would be long and difficult, but at least now she had a chance. She had her life back, and for Ryan, that was enough. As the officers finished collecting the evidence, Ryan stayed close to Sarah, making sure she was okay. He wasn't sure how long it would take for her to heal or if she ever truly would. But in this moment, he knew one thing for certain. The nightmare was over, and Sarah Monroe was finally free.